Good afternoon. And the game changers that I am supposed to talk about in next 15 minutes is genetics. How genetics has changed, has been a game changer, and recent advances in genetics. Now here I stand completely agreeing with you that this is totally inappropriate topic for a post-lunch session. But here we are. So, okay, now given the time limit, I am not at all going to touch upon any histomorphology, any immunohistochemistry, and straight away going to just allude on important issues in genetics which matters in the clinics today. But that does not mean that these two aspects of histopathology or pathology of pediatric tumors does not matter. In fact, they are the foundations of diagnosis, and genetics is kind of a topmost, what should I say, a part of the so-called pyramid or in the whole diagnostic, prognostic, and predictive process. But let us just focus on only molecular testing today. Just like you guys, trust me, even for pathologists who have passed their MD many years ago, as ancient as I am, when I passed my MD, molecular biology was not even on the horizon as far as your curriculum was concerned. So we have learned it literally on the job later on, and we are still learning. And whatever we see under the microscope or whatever we see in the clinics and then under the microscope, molecular biology is a completely different world altogether. You kind of delve down into the genes, and that world is so different than your usual histopathology. Where does the genetics really matter in pediatric solid tumors? These are 5 glaring examples: neuroblastoma, rhabdomyosarcoma, Ewing's family of tumors, Wilms tumor, and retinoblastoma. So I think except the Ewing's family of tumors, we have discussed the rest in the morning, but in my given time, I won't be able to cover all of them. Just let's look at the most important aspect. Coming to neuroblastoma, MICAN for many years has been established as an adverse prognostic factor in neuroblastoma. And neuroblastoma is a very unique tumor. It is clinically, morphologically, and genetically very heterogeneous. And the heterogeneity is because of the inherent wide spectrum of clinical behavior. And this clinical behavior it reflects on everything. It reflects on not only on the clinical behavior prognosis, but also histopathology is very heterogeneous, and molecular pathology or molecular biology of neuroblastoma is also very heterogeneous. And hence, it is very important for us to stratify the patients according to risk. That's what we discussed and emphasized in the morning session as well today. And the whole emphasis becomes ultimately on to avoid overtreatment based upon the risk assessment in some of the patients. So here we are talking about anemic amplification confers uniformly worse prognosis irrespective of age and stage. So even infants with anemic amplification becomes a uniformly poor prognosis, and it's a high-risk disease. So coming to the role of other molecular biology markers in prognostication of neuroblastoma, what matters? One is definitely haploidy, and another is segmental chromosomal aberrations, the SCAs. And ploidy, again, has been established that hyperdiploid tumors are usually good prognosis locoregional tumors as against the diploid tumors which have advanced stage neuroblastomas. Now coming to the segmental chromosomal aberrations, 11q23. This is present in 35 to 45% of newly diagnosed cases, and this deletion of 11q is associated with advanced disease, older age of the patients, and unfavorable histology, and this is actually mutually exclusive with anemic amplification, and hence the significance of detection of 11q. And the recent evidence shows that it is an independent prediction or predictive of disease relapse. And that is why it is a part of INRG classification, International Neuroblastoma Risk Group Consensus Pre-Treatment Classification Schema. I'm sure everybody in this auditorium is aware of the INRG classification of neuroblastoma. And in this chart, I want to highlight that apart from the histologic category and grade of differentiation, there are 3 biologic parameters, the MICN, the 11q, and the ploidy, that are incorporated in INRG classification. And all these parameters combined together would give us these 18 categories starting from very low risk to high risk neuroblastomas. But here, NMIC, ploidy, and 11q aberration is incorporated. However, the others are not. So INRG is stratifying the neuroblastomas into low risk, intermediate risk, and high risk categories, based upon which we are determining the treatment of a given patient, and which correlates essentially with survival. But what about the others? Now, this is the way forward. We are going even beyond the INRG now, beyond even MICN, beyond 11q, and beyond the ploidy. What's the current evidence? Now, here are certain other important genes. One is deletion of 1p36. This is seen also in around 35% of neuroblastomas at the time of diagnosis, but this is in association mostly with MICN amplification, as against 11q, which is mutually exclusive of NMIC. It is associated with increased risk of disease relapsed in localized tumors, and therefore, this becomes an independent predictor of unfavorable histology, especially for tumors which are of favorable histology and also low stage disease, stage 2 and stage 3. Similarly, unbalanced gain of 17q. This is the commonest of the translocation that you will find in neuroblastomas. Around 50% of neuroblastomas show this. The most, it is associated with overexpression of cervivin, and this is a harbinger of more aggressive neuroblastomas. And this is observed to be of particular significance in low stage diseases, again stage 1, 2, 3, and 4S. So, I mean, what's the significance? What are we talking here is that you have a neuroblastoma which is low stage, you have a neuroblastoma which has favorable histology, which may not have NMIC amplification, but it becomes aggressive disease by virtue of presence of these unbalanced gain or segmental chromosomal aberrations. Now, coming to some more evidence as far as the significance of segmental chromosomal aberrations go. Here is a paper published in 2011 which looked at infants with localized, unresectable, as well as the disseminated neuroblastomas without NMIC amplification, and they found that there is an increase in segmental chromosomal aberrations with increasing stages, and the progression-free survival was poorer in the patients whose tumors harbored these segmental chromosomal aberrations. And so, again, we are just re-emphasizing the same thing, that this recognizes the infants with otherwise low-risk tumors, that is, for example, stage 4S, MICN non-amplified neuroblastomas. This, I think we discussed one exactly similar case this morning, where we needed NMIC amplification, and Dr. Kurkure emphasized on the significance of performing biologic studies precisely for the same reason. Then there are certain other studies which are also emphasizing on the presence of segmental chromosomal aberrations being of worse prognostic significance in neuroblastomas. So segmental chromosomal aberration associated with inferior event-free survivals in localized neuroblastomas, and the important thing which is emerging currently is that it is not which gene, but it is also how many number of genes are showing the aberrations. That means a number of segmental chromosomal aberrations present in a given neuroblastoma. That is a predictive of metastatic disease or aggressive behavior. And this particular study came up with the cutoff of 5. If the SCAs are more than 5, they have demonstrated aggressive behavior in neuroblastoma. So essentially, starting from MICN, we are moving towards multiplex gene testing. And there are a number of genes which are tested. MLPA is one of the platforms that helps us to test multiple genes at one given time. And this is called as a multiplex ligation probe amplification. It is a very useful technique. That's because this is just a multiplex PCR. It is nothing more than that. It is not an NGS platform. But the labs which do not have NGS platforms, this is a great technique to try for multiplex testing. We have started it since last 2 years, and we test segmental chromosomal aberrations at almost on the 9 chromosomes here, 1p, 3p, and that most importantly, it includes 2p on which the NMIC lies. So this one test would cover the NMIC as well as other gene testing. And this is how the graphs, ultimate graphs of MLPA look like, and we look at the ultimate ratio of normal to abnormal, and that is how it is read. As I said, we just learned it on the job. It was just started 2 years ago. So in our, we have just a small series to analyze. We examined around 42 patients in whom we have tested, we have done MLPA and tested for multiple SCAs. And we have found that 17q gains and amplification was found in 75% of our patients, followed by 11q loss, which was the commonest, and followed by 3p loss. The rate of MICAN amplification was 16% in our series. And I must tell you at this stage, MLPA is very, very important, very useful. But if we acquire a next generation sequencing platform, the NGS platform, we might just phase out MLPA and shift to NGS. Now here, just I'm ending with the neuroblastoma genetics here. But now the very important question right now is, we have we have the biology, we have the technique to detect SCAs. We do have published evidence to, which tells us that, okay, this is bad, and this is bad. What are we doing about it in the clinics? That is the question now. We are testing around 9 chromosomes, so what action are we taking on it? So the honest answer is, right now, it is useful in our patients who are suffering from infantile neuroblastomas. If they are low-stage disease, if they are NMIC non-amplified, even 11q is not found to be aberrated, then we take the other chromosomes into account, and if the SCAs are found into other chromosomes, then we are increasing the risk from low risk to at least intermediate risk, but not beyond that. So in an infantile neuroblastoma, NMIC amplification is the only high-risk biological criteria even today. So it is upstage up to maybe intermediate risk for treatment purposes. So there are some patients who otherwise we wouldn't have given treatment, but because of MLPA, we have increased the risk and we are giving chemotherapy. But the non-infantile neuroblastomas, as of now, there are no guidelines and we are not making use of the MLPA, but I must say that is the next step forward. So we may not be, maybe we should just wait for more evidence to emerge, and there would be a time where there can be more guidelines about it because the evidence is really compelling. So the risk stratification might change, integrating more and more of the biological parameters within the neuroblastoma risk stratification. So coming to the next tumor, that's rhabdomyosarcoma. There are two histologic types of rhabdomyosarcoma, alveolar and embryonal. Recurrent reciprocal translocations are observed in alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, which is absent in embryonal rhabdomyosarcoma. And this biologic fact is used for differential diagnosis between these two entities. So these translocations, there are, again, within the category of alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, there are two categories. One is PAX3 FKHR translocation and another is PAX7 FKHR translocation. And even, so this is just one of the examples. This is a PCR. It is a gel, which we used to do some time ago. Now we have shifted to real-time PCR. This is showing a PAX3 FKHR translocation in one of the alveolar rhabdomyosarcomas. So it's been known since years that alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma is biologically more aggressive than the embryonal rhabdomyosarcomas. But having said that, there is also a prognostic subgrouping within ARMS. That PAX3 FKHR positive ARMSs they are more aggressive than the PAX7 FKHR rhabdomyosarcomas. The estimated 4-year survival rate of 75% versus the 8% for PAX3 FKHR, and significantly increased risk of failure and death in a metastatic disease if that alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma is PAX3 FKHR positive. So the question that we are coming to here is that either an alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma which does not have translocation or the alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma which has PAX3 FKHR translocation, are they equivalent to the ARMS which is showing PAX3 FKHR? Sorry, PAX7 is better than PAX3. So are they biologically similar? Clinically they don't seem to be, but maybe morphologically they are. So we are again moving from a basic morphology, basic immunohistochemistry to a molecular classification of rhabdomyosarcomas wherein the presence of detection of translocation is clinically more relevant than the histologic subtype. And this question was discussed in the morning session as well when Tushar asked this question whether you would detect the translocation in all cases of rhabdomyosarcoma. So I just reserved that answer based upon our own experience. Recently we looked at a series of our alveolar rhabdomyosarcomas, all rhabdomyosarcomas where we had performed the molecular testing. So there is a little bit of selection bias. So because of that selection bias, we could find around 56%, quite a high number of rhabdomyosarcomas showing translocation. But that's not what I want to make a point of. What I want to say is that we diagnose about 56% of histologically diagnosed ARMS showed positive translocation. That means 44% of histologically diagnosed ARMS did not show translocation, either of PAX3 or PAX7. On the other hand, 12.5% of histologically diagnosed ERMS showed positive translocation. Now, this is not a very, very encouraging result to me as a histopathologist, where diagnosis of alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma is purely on morphologic basis, and that is what drives the molecular testing, as Shalini said in the morning, that unless a pathologist raises the doubt of alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, you don't do testing for translocation. But this is an eye-opener for us, that histology may not be a answer in all cases of rhabdomyosarcoma, and we actually are coming to asking this question that do translocation negative ARMS really exist? Okay, and does also histopathology, is it really sensitive enough to give you the translocation status of a given ARMS? So my answer at this moment would be no, we should detect translocations in all RMS. We have already moved in that direction. All our patients with rhabdomyosarcomas go for translocation. The slides which are skipped, I just wanted to tell you that apart from the prognostication and risk stratification like in rhabdomyosarcoma and neuroblastoma, there are a lot of advances which are happened on the diagnostic front as well, wherein there are a lot more entities which are being discovered based upon molecular signatures, and those tumors which are dependent upon the recognition of a specific molecular signature eventually are proving to be biologically different than the conventional tumors right now. But fine, we can skip that part. So that's my last slide. Today in your clinics, we start with, the diagnostic process starts with morphology, then we do immunohistochemistry, and these rectangular blocks are telling us that all of my 100% of cases go for immunohistochemistry as far as the diagnostic process is concerned. But even we have the access to molecular pathology resources in every aspect. Now, even today, we are not doing molecular testing on all patients, but where is it mandatory is that now, as I just said, we are doing molecular testing on all patients with rhabdomyosarcomas. Then, by default, all infants with neuroblastomas, if not with all patients with neuroblastomas. And then third is the undifferentiated round cell tumors. And whenever required, the difficult cases where immunohistochemistry is not helpful, we resort to molecular diagnostics for the detection of RT-PCR, that's detection of fusion gene proteins. So, thank you.